Welcome to Walk the Talk, Talk the Walk, a series that explores anti-racism and how to make spaces truly safe for walking, biking, and rolling. We will center the voices and lived experiences of communities most excluded and impacted by racist urban planning and active transportation advocacy. The goal of this series is to educate, connect, and inspire folks across differences to create a new world where everyone is affirmed when they walk or use mobility devices in the right of way. So let's get to it. Let's walk the talk.
My name is Charlene McGee, and I work at Multnomah County Health Department, where I have the privilege of working as the REACH Program Manager. And REACH stands for Racial and Ethnic Approaches to Community Health. We are funded by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention to address the racial and ethnic health disparities among Multnomah County's Black and African immigrant population.
My name is Jess Thompson, and I'm the Executive Director at Oregon Walks. Oregon Walks is a 30-year-old grassroots organization dedicated to promoting walking and creating conditions that make it safe, convenient, and attractive for everyone walking in Oregon. We have a couple of different ways that we do that. One is we have a walking menu where we partner with organizations and groups to provide walk leader trainings, open streets events, walking groups, and connection between folks with lived experience with walking in under-resourced areas and policymakers. Additionally, we engage in advocacy for walking as a solution for health, climate, transportation, and racial justice. And finally, through our Plans and Projects Committee, we provide municipalities with pedestrian-focused technical assistance and feedback on transportation plans and projects. Our membership and supporters are overwhelmingly white, liberal progressives like me, wanting to shift and do better. For the past 5 years, we have shifted our advocacy and programming to center first equity in general, and in the past year, racial equity specifically in our programming and advocacy. We have a very long way to go, but we are committed to doing the work.
So I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Destiny Thomas and Thrivance Group. Thrivance Group works to bring culturally restorative concepts into the lived experiences of their clients and community partners. Through project management, youth services, and community engagement, they strive to fortify the spaces and places that are invested in the well-being and collective healing of those who are most vulnerable to the disparity, displacement, and disenfranchisement. Thrivance is passionate about creating a world where everyone has equitable access to space, to safe neighborhoods, beautiful spaces, social enterprise, healthy food options, quality healthcare, affordable housing, active transportation, and clean air and water. Dr. Destiny Thomas is the founder and chief executive officer of Thrivance Group, an anthropologist planner from Oakland, California. Dr. Thomas has a combined 6 years of experience working in a project manager capacity within government agencies, including Caltrans and the city of Los Angeles. In addition to this, Dr. Thomas has 7 years of experience leading key advancements in racial equity initiatives across the state by way of community organizing, policy writing, and nonprofit management in communities that have been most impacted by racial inequities. Dr. Thomas' hallmark impact on the planning sector is the development of the dignity-infused community engagement framework, and more recently, Purplelining theory. Shall we begin? Dr. Thomas.
I want to thank you for having me. I want to thank Oregon Walks for partnering with me. And I want to thank Jess and Izzy, Charlene for trusting me to be the inaugural invitee to Walk the Talk. This is a special edition because we will simulcast this through our digital protest this week, our digital teach-in called the Unurbanist Assembly. So I'm going to dig into a little bit about purplelining, and then we'll come back for some discussion. So purplelining is a term that I've been using more frequently lately. to talk a little bit about how the urban planning and transportation field as a whole has devolved into something that is starting to feel a bit repressive, especially when it comes to process and decision making. But I also want to offer up a couple of solutions for how we get to a place of healing in our work as designers, engineers, and planners. I usually tell this story. It was a transformative moment for me in my professional background when I went out to a street in South Central to engage about a project as a city planner. Was really, really excited because this particular street was getting improvements after not having any infrastructure-based investment for the last 40 years. And we had been awarded the funding to put these interventions in place based on the fact that mostly children were being killed in car crashes while walking. And so we decided, as a celebratory effort, but also as a data collection effort, to engage with and interact with children. So we created an entire space called Children's Village. And while we were there, we used these dry erase boards to collect data or to ask children about, what you want to see in the space. What do you love most about walking? Where do you ride your bike? In this instance, we settled on my safety is important because. And there was one young woman, she was actually, I believe, like 7 years old, that no matter how much we reiterated the question, no matter what infrastructure plans we talked about, no matter how many times we even offered her a free bike, she could not arrive at a notion of safety that wasn't connected to being in the house. And this was transformative for me because something that I already knew, right, which was there's way more that goes into the lived experience outside than just how the street is configured. But it really was compelling to me to hear out of a child's mouth, a 7-year-old's mouth, that her priorities had less to do with how we were planning to reconfigure the street and more to do with the fact that her optimal sense of safety only came from being indoors. And she actually felt like she was most safe in the back of the house. So as we began to talk to her about this, we realized that not only was the street unsafe for people walking and traveling, but that what was going on in the space was so traumatic to her that it was even impacting her while she was in the house. This is important context because I often talk to people about urban planning and transportation planning, and folks always feel like I'm making this giant leap between what we have planned in the environment, and redlining, which is our sector's legacy of institutionalized racism. But to me, it's not a leap. So I want to walk through a little bit about, am I still there? I want to talk through a little bit about the history of redlining and how it kind of has evolved into what we call urban planning today. So here's some of the details about what we already know. We know that it was something that started in the 1930s. It was a way for banks, investors, and government agencies to sort of control who had access to home ownership. And really what I want to highlight here is that it took all of those entities conspiring to create this notion of whiteness as an ideal personhood to really make redlining an impactful policy. So the practice is widely known for creating the segregation of neighborhoods that we see today, right? It's where the hood came from. It's how we kept Black and brown people out of white neighborhoods, which traditionally have been suburbs, not so much today. But what I really want what people to focus on is that this was a mechanism. This mechanism was also used to keep people from receiving financing to renovate and retrofit their houses. So even when we relegated Black and brown people to specific neighborhoods and out of white neighborhoods, this mechanism was also used to keep those same people from practicing self-determination and having quality of life, even in their own spaces. So redlining was not just about restricting access, it was also about actively working to repress the individual notion of humanity in Black and Brown communities. That's an important detail, right? So this is a redlining map. I don't know what city that is, but every redlining map kind of looks like this. The red areas where you found the most highest concentration of Black people, and therefore the housing that had the lowest economic value. The yellow was a little bit more mixed, maybe brown, maybe some Southeast Asian in there. And then the blue and green areas was where white people could enjoy quality living amenities, transportation amenities, and so on and so forth, and definitely access to quality housing. So when we think about redlining, we think about how it really created the circumstances and the dynamics that made being outside in Black and brown neighborhoods synonymous with excessive blight, constant exposure to environmental hazards, economic scarcity, divestment, and there's just a general sense of like undesirability, not just in the land and environment itself, but in the people who live there. And so this brings me back to that original story that I shared, that this notion or interpretation of the word safety, literally it's impossible for safety to show up within the confines and constructs of the environments and communities that were created through this legacy of planning. So when we think about the young woman who had a hard time helping us understand how to redesign her community to make her feel more safe, this is a legacy that we can't forget. So before we move on, I want us to think back to what the key elements of redlining were, right? This procedural erasure, which meant that entire groups of people were erased from a decision-making process about their own lives and livelihood, that people convened, that these different entities and agents convened and conspired to make that procedural erasure a thing, that the main function of it was repression, because promoting privilege, promoting white comfort on its own doesn't stand. You also simultaneously have to be repressing the so-called other in order for that to be active. It was state sanctioned. So it wasn't just a few people or even the housing industry having racist values that were sort of vigilante in nature. No, they conspired along with the state, and the state, the people who we pay our taxes to and who are responsible for protecting us and maintaining wellness, sanction these activities and help create the dynamic. What really is, in my perception, a hallmark element of redlining is the centering of white comfort. So white people had the opportunity to choose where they would live, and once they chose where they would live, they had the benefit of that entire community and landscape being designed around what made them comfortable. So when we hear people today talking about bike lanes are for white people, what we're really hearing is this notion of carving out space overnight through quick build projects without community consensus is a performance of centering the white comfort that existed and is germane to suburban culture. So that's why Black people, particularly elder Black people, view bike lanes and sprawling sidewalks and open spaces as being elements of white culture, because they were created in order to separate white people from Black people and to keep them comfortable with that separation. That leads into the next bullet, which is this is one of the ways we came up with like this notion of model minorities. So if we go back to that redlining map, we saw that it wasn't just Black and white squares, that we could see a visual representation of proximity to whiteness. So in the planning field now, when we think about whose voices are being silenced and what communities aren't being centered in our planning and design, we think about that scale of proximity to whiteness and how even if you are considered POC or a person of color, your distance from Blackness affords you more privilege and more voice in these public planning processes. So that's something that we can't lose through this discussion. The next thing is that we should really pay attention to is that redlining as a policy has been incredibly resistant to regulatory reforms. So even though we have things like Fair Housing Act and other housing protections and renter protections, and in some cases, housing incentives, redlining had such an impact, a deep-rooted impact in our structural context of space and place, that we are still dealing with its impacts today. So what this says to me is we can't afford to make overnight decisions, quick decisions that exclude people from those decision-making processes, because even when we come back and realize that those decisions had either unintended harms or intentional harms, it will take us generations to recover. And then lastly, it's important to know that systems like redlining are they uphold and they're upheld by other symptoms of structural racism. So people's experience with oppression comes from an experience that is interlocking in nature. These things overlap. And so again, it's not just the presence of systemic racism in this one way of life or one aspect of our lived experience. It actually creates innovation, in the realm of oppression for other systems to build upon it. So this is a map of Oakland in 1937. This is their redlining map. And as you can see what I just described, you'll see the red areas, which was where the Black people and probably immigrants were relegated to. And the yellow areas are more of a mixed area where you might start to see brown people or very, very low income white people living. And then the blue and the green areas were predominantly white. So you see this construction of inner city versus suburban culture, right? This is a map of today's CalEnviro screen in Oakland. So very similarly, you'll see a concentration of unhealthy environmental and public health conditions, literally situated on top of communities that have historically been earmarked as less desirable, less worthy of investment, and inhabited by people who were not model minorities. This is not beautiful, but an overlay of those two maps together. And so what you should be struggling with right now is seeing the difference between the two maps, right? We know that red is still very prominent. We see that yellow starting to turn a little bit orange, but we know for sure by looking at this map that the green and blue areas are still very green and blue. Oakland is known for being in the midst of its third wave of gentrification right now. We talk about Oakland as being a former chocolate city, heavily populated with white tech industry folks, but we see even here with this overlay that not only are white people converging on what we would call the inner city or the urban center, but they're still holding on to the space that they held in the exterior of the urban center. This is really troubling because when we talk about gentrification, we also have to talk about displacement. And we're not seeing anywhere that when people get displaced, where they can go. So this is one of the reasons why Oakland is suffering from crippling houselessness and is lacking the resources that it needs in order to solve that problem. Because now what was a process that was created to racialize oppression is now impacting people who might have fit into the model minority construct, but because it's such a crippling, long-standing structural issue with such deep-seated roots, we literally can't reverse the process even when it's affecting white people themselves. So let's talk a little bit about the connections between redlining and transportation planner. Given what we know and what we just talked about regarding redlining, one could say that car culture actually stems from a historic desire to uphold white comfort. Today, we talk about car culture as being something that Black and Brown communities need to let go of, right? And we need to get Black and Brown communities access to these other modes. But we can't ignore the fact that when high income white folks chose to move out to the suburbs to get away from Black and Brown folks, they then had to invest in car culture, build infrastructure to continue to access the urban center where they exploited and took advantage of Black and Brown labor. That car culture was literally created to uphold white comfort in the built environment. So what we're hearing when we say, well, we want single family suburban homes, we're also hearing white people historically saying, we're willing to pay the cost of keeping our communities white and keeping our distance from the people we've deemed other in our construct of who's the ideal or model citizen. Another connection to transportation is that white privilege is literally the value that funds and has funded historically our highway network. So this is where we saw entire government entities commit to multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar projects to create infrastructure to support the desire to preserve white comfort. So we're seeing a history and a precedent for government agencies using taxpayer dollars, right, to help conspire with private sector and with white supremacist values to maintain and uphold this notion. Important detail to keep in mind. Another connection that we have is, this unintended burden of transportation costs that came about, right? Folks didn't know how expensive it would be when they made that choice. That self-harm to white economy was not enough to convince them that they could have comfort or be human beings and still live near Black people. And this resistance to humanizing Blackness is something that's still very pervasive in our efforts to transportation planning. This is why we often hear a lot of pushback around community engagement, because people are still wrestling with this notion of coming to the table and leveling with Black folks who have been left out of this process for generations. Another connection is, and probably some folks would argue with, but these current versions of like model urban neighborhoods continue to reproduce the legacy of racism. And so even as whiteness has reconverged or descended or ascended onto the urban center, we're still finding ways to uphold white supremacy within that, right? So we're seeing, although the Fair Housing Act was passed several decades ago, we're seeing lenders add incentives to people who are buying homes in areas that they consider good urban centers, right? So we're beginning to see this practice of determining what neighborhoods or what blocks or what communities are good versus which are bad. So it's not, we want to incentivize you creating access to transportation no matter where you build. It's, we want to see a degree of, we want to see less risk, right? Based on the racial composition of the community in our investment. So we are still defining who is good and where good exists within the confines of what has historically been deemed the inner city or the hood. So we're recreating the dynamic of redlining through our linkages between transportation planning and investments and housing planning and investments. Transportation has now entered the space as an active conspirator of New Age redlining. this is another dynamic that's coming up with transportation planning. Make outside great again, right? So we're seeing a lot of discussion about being outside, especially during COVID-19, that centers recreation, it centers joy, sometimes it centers public health. All these things are great, but when you tack the word white in front of them, right, it suggests a different type of reality for different people. So we can't forget that the legacy of centering white comfort is where many Black communities, many elders got this perception that vast and transformational investments in any kind of infrastructure, but especially transportation related infrastructure, is a precursor to the displacement and gentrification that is usually spurred by the centering of white comfort in public process. So bike lanes are notorious for giving people the perception that they're about to be displaced. A lot of folks will ask for the data, but we have an entire legacy and we have the facts, right, that prove that no matter what the benefits of this element are, its origin story is highly problematic and rooted in racist practice. We've got to redo that. We've got to undo it, and we've got to do something new. Another connection is that the infrastructure, the introduction of lived conditions and values that are that correlate with like white suburban utopianism are heavily embedded in progressive language about transportation planning. And what I mean by that is it's not like suburban white folks woke up one day, or transportation advocates or bike and ped advocates woke up one day and said, you know what we did to the hood was really foul. Let's like work with them to provide the space and needs and design that centers them today, but also atones for the harm and the longstanding impacts of that harm. That's not what happened. What happened was white people decided living in the suburbs was too inconvenient and too expensive and relocated back to the urban center and decided the only way they could possibly do that is to bring the amenities that they enjoyed, right? Endless amounts of space, wide pathways to ride your bike, well-built sprawling sidewalks and green space back to the hood so that they can be comfortable even among Black and brown folks. There's no problem with any of those amenities. But again, if we're not addressing the systemic roots of racism within the desire to center white comfort in our work, then we are bound to reproduce the trauma and the negative impacts of our planning in the past. So when I think about people accusing me of making a leap in my assessment of what we would call open streets or play streets or complete streets today and structural racism, my retort is that you're assuming that these elements that are synonymous with widespread wellness, right, and are also designed to center white comfort will automatically benefit communities that have never been invested in, like for generations. And that's simply not how it works. So what I propose is that this effort or desire to quickly transform the urban center, maybe some of us are well-meaning and we're really doing it in the name of improving the lived conditions of Black and brown people, Indigenous people, people living with disabilities, and immigrants. Maybe that's really our premise, right? But we still can't abandon the fact that we have a generational crisis, a relationship with the environment that spans generations, right? That has told us and embedded in us that being outside is innately harmful. And that even in our desires to be outside, we are signing up this social contract to be surveilled, to be sick, and to be abused in the built environment. That's how Black people, many, not all, but many Black people perceive being outside. That's a generational crisis that we've got to resolve before we start dropping interventions onto the ground. So I want to remind folks of the 7-year-old, right, that said the safest place to her was inside the house, and preferably in the back of the house. That's not an irrational perspective. That's not an unreasonable desire. This 7-year-old has the presence of mind to know. She might not have the language, right? But she knows if a 7-year-old can walk outside and her intuition tell her it's not safe, regardless of how the street is configured, then we have a much bigger problem or much bigger things to advocate for than just where to put paint and bollards. What I'm not saying, just to recap, because I know some folks will say what I said and it will be wrong. I'm not saying that bike lanes, accessible sidewalks, and suburban design concepts are bad for Black people. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that walking and biking aren't modes of travel that Black people would choose. I am also not saying that I love cars, right? I'm also not saying that I like when transportation advocates get upset with me for honoring and acknowledging cars as a choice mode. And I'm also not saying that all bike riders are racist. What I am saying is that our processes and our concepts have to begin to decenter white comfort, and that our transit systems and networks were built to repress freedom of movement. And so it's probably virtually impossible to reimagine or rebuild our existing transit systems without completely starting over, because the literal routes were built to repress and to restrict. And then I'm also really what I'm saying is all of this turns into speculation, housing speculation in every area that chooses to center white comfort. No matter where that value pops up, we are bound to experience urban speculation and housing speculation. And that is a problem that we have to stop, because that is something, the impacts of that will have far-reaching and very long-term negative effects on public health, right? So I'm ready to make my next leap. Purplelining, hear me out. So we talked about redlining. I want to talk about purplelining. So this is a map of Oakland's 2020 slow streets is what we're calling it, I think now. This map is an overlay, again, not cute, but still valid, of the Calvin screen map that I shared earlier, the redlining map from 1937, and the slow streets map. Just like what we saw when we did the overlay of the Calvin screen and the redlining, the historic redlining map, what we see here is that although there is geographic equity, right, in the implementation of slow streets, we are also still seeing a concentration of resources in terms of how Oakland's slow streets program defines resources, a concentration of resources in areas that have historically benefited from redlining. What's troubling about this to me is that we, admittedly may have skipped some opportunities for community engagement. Okay, that's a philosophical argument. But what's also troubling to me is that if our understanding of equity or racial atonement is rooted in sprinkling a little bit across the whole area and not about dealing with the real infrastructural and environmental inequities and toxic industry that's literally beneath the pavement that we're putting bike lanes on, and having a long-term plan to undo that harm, we are actually conspirators and co-conspirators in this new wave of redlining. So I call it purplelining because I thought the purple lines have been showing up in a lot of places, but I also call it purplelining because When we think about racism and infrastructure and systemic racism, we think about hyper-conservative, we think about white supremacy, right? We think about the MAGAs, right? The conversation we're not having though is that white progressivism, right? And these notions of self-righteous innovation and sustainability, right? The blue side of things, the progressive side of things, is also co-conspiring in the creation of this dynamic that erases people from processes, and imposes interventions that may have long-term unintended effects. So blue and red together makes purple. So it's this introduction or this seeping out of centering white comfort across the spectrum, you know, of political affiliation, across the spectrum of economic affiliation or status. It's really getting to a point where our anti-Blackness is so embedded in our policies and practices that you can't tell who's doing the harm. So are slow streets, or can slow streets move us toward actual atonement? Right now, the way they're unrolling or being rolled out, the answer is no, right? Is it too late for that answer to be yes? Absolutely not. But this is the framework and the concept that we have to grab hold of before we can actually start to promote the public health benefits that we use as a guise to promote these new projects that truly are just there to make white folks more comfortable in this time of unrest and pandemic. So my definition of purplelining is a planning process by which certain neighborhoods and certain people are deemed expendable due to their racial, cultural, or economic location on the spectrum of socioeconomic privilege. People get purple lined as a result of structural and collective effort to control the means to mobility and movement, which at this time are quintessential components of dignity, social cohesion, and wellness. This is important because what we saw with redlining was that at the time, the quintessential notion of, you know, upright citizenship was home ownership, right? Like you weren't experiencing the American dream unless you were a homeowner, right? Now, as evidence in a lot of ways, one of the ways we express as a culture broadly, one of the ways we express our privilege, our power, our personhood is through our freedom to move through spaces with autonomy, right? And even with anonymity, if we so choose, right? And so that value, that construct of humanness is threatened when we create processes and implement projects that reproduce the problematic and very racist roots of redlining. So I want to bring you back to key elements of purplelining. What you'll see here is that they're very similar to the key elements of redlining. We saw procedural erasure, right? Where we didn't even bother to check in with certain communities, but we were claiming to benefit them through our work. We see repression, which is literally the design concept of slow streets, if we're being honest. But we also saw some silencing happening with advocates, including myself, who spoke out about what was going wrong with the process. We saw those people be attacked and silenced. It is for sure state sanctioned and operated by and imposed by multiple agencies that receive our taxpayer dollars. Centers white comfort. I'm pretty sure that there was a convening of white advocates across the country that decided this would be a great opportunity during a pandemic to implement hundreds of thousands of closed streets. It also is a model minority construct, right? Because what we saw was certain people who may not have the lived experience or the oral or institutional history to remember and to understand where these legacies stem from. We saw people who looked like me, right, begin to advocate in favor of these practices because they didn't have a relationship with the trauma that I was expressing, right, after having lived through several versions of redlining myself. So now we're seeing certain people who move around in bodies that have a little bit of proximity to Blackness in favor of these exclusionary practices because they don't have the personal lived experiences. They've been propped up as model minorities within their agencies and within their peer groups. So they're now aligning with and sounding like the entities and the interests that reproduce, structural racism and oppression. What we should be mindful of, and what we're already seeing, is that these practices like open streets and closed streets and slow streets and healthy streets will be resistant to regulatory reforms, right? You don't have to go through an environmental review for a bike lane that you claim is benefiting public health, right? We saw a lot of fluidity around how the Measure M dollars could be used, to the point that they could even be distributed to law enforcement officers in the name of education about bike lanes, right? So this is just what we're seeing today, but it'll be very hard to undo the legacy of purplelining after this moment, such that we're already hearing cities talk about making those interventions permanent. So this process doesn't even match how we would typically do permanent or long-range infrastructure planning. However, the fact that the interim intervention was accepted and that we managed to exclude so many people from the process, and we have already made a basis for long-term negative or unintended impacts of the work. And then lastly, just like redlining, the practice and the process itself, again, not the bike lane or the open street, but the process itself is what upholds and validates other systems of structural racism and the processes by which those roll out as well. I want to remind folks one more time about the 7-year-old that feels safest when she's inside. As we talk about how beautiful it would be to put our babies in helmets and take pictures of them grinning with missing teeth to put on Instagram in an open street or in a slow street and experience recreation. We now have this racist legacy of planning coupled with literal design that is Eurocentric and white comfort centering in its nature. And on top of the fact that now we're literally seeing and experiencing waves of Black death at the hands of the state in these same streets. What do we do to resist it? I know we'll talk about this today, but even the most altruistic, data-driven, transformative design concepts require some kind of reckoning with the past, right? And so we've got to have a plan that works to heal existing trauma, but we also have to resist the tendency to move through our work and be motivated by convenience and comfort, right? Comfort and convenience are not sustainable basis for urban planning and design. Couple of ways we get there is by operationalizing this notion of dignity, which I know we'll talk a little bit about. Imagining what it would be to completely divorce our understanding of what we mean when we say place, right? And to consider the ways other people who have never been considered in our work are accessing and converging in the built environment, right? Thinking about our underground economies, thinking about how, the irony that street vendors who we've been trying to repress for the last 5 years and get off streets for the last 5 years have now been essential workers during this time and primary sources of food for a lot of households. And we've never planned for them. We've never supported their economy. And then lastly, really, really thinking about what it would look like to not just divest from police, but to divest from other people who are complicit in that cycle of harm and cycle of institutionalized racism. we need to have a long-term plan, right? In a lot of these places, like in East Oakland, we're seeing concepts for quick build projects literally going above or on communities where there is no floodplain planning, there's dust bowls, there's toxic industry, there's no curb ramps, real basic, no drainage, right? Infestation of so many different things because we've never invested in long range planning there. So it's a slap in the face to suggest that our public health woes will be solved by open street during COVID-19. Let's honor mode choice. Let's come back to this. Let's think about who created car culture, why it was created, and who was entrapped or entangled in that culture, and how difficult it would be, and how the conditions around us and the policies and structures around us make choosing a mode much more complex for many of us versus those of us who can be champions for bikes and peds. Let's decommodify movement altogether, right? Let's subsidize these choices and let's make transit free, right? And let's say it with our actions. Let's move away from learning and listening and reading circles. And let's really press ourselves to come up with ways to use our specific position in our specific roles within this conspiratory dynamic to really achieve and see change in the long term and in the immediate term as well. I want to thank you all again for letting me share these ideas and give my personal understanding of how we got here as a field, and want to invite folks to hear and learn more about it through our Unurbanist Assembly.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That was an earful, right?
So good.
It was the truth, though.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, actually, something that I know we have sets of questions to go through, but something that you said that actually struck me was like literally in the midst of the public health pandemic, as a public health professional, realizing how we were literally seeped in trying to figure out what the response would be around a public health pandemic. Mm-hmm. But then seeing how open streets were popping up all over. And I think there was like a part of me in there, I was like, where do they even have the time and energy to do this right now?
And the money.
But I think for me, it was thinking, right, like knowing like one of the interventions that we needed in the midst of, right, I'm talking about like towards the end of March, like I started to see stuff pop up from different cities. But I'm like, we don't even have enough PPEs.
Right.
We're trying to figure out public health, how to educate the community to wear face masks, right? We're trying to figure out what the recommendations should be, but yet the streets are being redesigned. And I'm like, I don't know, as you're saying it, literally, I'm like, they were ahead, but we didn't even have enough of what we needed to have people to be ushered out into the space that were being designed for people to be in. And yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and even in our very selfish desire to be innovative and opportunistic, how would it have been to have like safe routes for mutual aid designated? Mm-hmm. Or what would it have looked like for a mayor to say, I want to dedicate 70 miles to COVID-19 triage, open air hospitals,
I mean, or like, I think like even the context of, being in Portland, right? Like what would it have looked like with, and I'm like, I don't know, this might be, I want to put my disclaimer out there, this may be a radical thought, right? But what does it look like if we would have, like our city partners would have been like, we're going to reallocate 2% of our gas tax, right? To respond to public health in the midst of this pandemic. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
I think it's, if you think about, like one of the thoughts I shared early on with the COVID-19 was also just how underfunded public health has been for decades.
Right.
For decades. And in part, but yet public health is being forced to respond in this way, right? What does it look like to really reimagine, right? And to do public health in a different way and ensure that, you know, I think for like planning and open streets and all of the design efforts that are happening, what does it look like when you really embed health, right? Show equity into every decision-making process, right? Not an afterthought, not a midway thought, right? Yeah. But really being intentional and understanding how literally we see data that we can connect by zip code. It is not accidental, right? It's data. I mean, you see the inequities based on zip codes, by educational level, health status, economic development opportunities. It's systemic, right? But I think sometimes we want to look at it in the separate, you know, these silo buckets, and in actuality, it's not, right? Because the individuals and communities that we're talking about are whole people.
Right. Yeah, the public health sector actually gave us all a gift with the introduction of research, deep research into health disparity. I don't even think we had language about inequity and disparity and even structural racism until the whistleblowers or the revolutionaries within public health started saying, hey, like, this is deeply ingrained in how we do things, and it's killing folks, still killing folks. And so we can look to the public health industry who's been talking about structural racism and inequity and disparity for all of the 30 years of my life. I'm 35, but you know, you get my drift. All of my life, you know, and the fact that we still haven't solved this problem, right? If we are just getting to a point where as a sector, transportation planning, urban planning, we are just now slightly leaning into and listening to the narrative of inequity, we are in trouble. We're in trouble.
You know, actually, I'm thinking back to the quote of the 7-year-old.
Yeah.
Right? I'm like, that's a change agent. And when you share that story, it reminded me of this conversation I had with my son. So this must have been maybe about 8-9 months ago. So he's now 12. At the time he was 11. And he says to me, he's like, Mommy, do you realize they have these, why are they having these bikes all over the place? But not everybody has sidewalks to be out. And I looked at him, I was like, you know what you're talking about? Is because he always sees me. It's like everything turns into a public health conversation. I was like, exactly what you're talking about is what we talk about at work, right? And then he went further. He's like, and you know, and they're all motorized, right? Maybe that's part of what's contributing to obesity. I was like, oh, honey. I was like, it could be a part, but it's so much deeper, right? I was like, access to food, it's physical activity. Like even now with COVID, you know, they were talking about budget cuts and they're cutting PE in the schools. And he's like, see, like, I don't understand. Why would they cut PE when we need PE? I say, you know, that could be a whole policy thing you should go and talk to the school board about. You know, I think it's also trying to help people to connect the dots, because I think oftentimes, you know, I think you think bikes, right? But it's more than bike. You know, and I think also when I think about like planning and the conversations, like how do we help to connect the dots? I think that's definitely one thing that public health brings to the table, is that in as much as everything is public health, right? I'm like, because when you're looking at the population, you have to look at the entire population, right? Not just one segment of it. I think actually like last couple of weeks, I've been doing a lot of talks and interviews just around racism as a public health issue in the public, and, you know, different folks reaching out to us. And I'm like, it's systemic, right? Because it's not accidental.
No, it's not. Yeah.
Investments have not been accidental. You know, they knew exactly what they were doing. You know, I think people are like, oh, we didn't see color. Yes, you did.
You drew it in color.
Yes, you did.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, yes, you did. It was there. You choosing to say you don't see color, right? I'm colorblind. the mere fact you're saying you're colorblind means that you're acknowledging color.
Yeah. And I think this connection between public health and transportation planning or urban design is a true connection. It's a true correlation in that many of the same, if not all of the same entities or agents that conspired to create redlining were also active conspirators in the dynamics that created inequity and disparity in public health. This is why all of our indicator maps, when you overlap them, look like the same map. Same key players, and same people that we are enacting harm upon. And then I would even add to that what's worsening, what is aligning with new urbanism, right? The ways we have now started to create micro versions of redlining within the urban center also shows up in public health, in our public health data collection and analysis, right? And what I'm getting at there is that as we start to lump people into categories like POC, Black, white, who we're not talking about is what it means from a public health and built environment perspective to be a Black man with a mental illness outside, what it is like to be someone who is not as able-bodied as the decision makers, to be that and Black in the public realm in the ways that that's criminalized or shamed. What it is to be a trans Black woman and not even be reflected in the data at all. And in a study called How Women Travel, what it means to be Indigenous and to constantly see your identity represented as not sufficient enough to be counted.
When you were the starting of the country, right? Like you're
yeah, I think that if we could map, I mean, we do map data, right? But if data itself were a mapping exercise, we will see that in the same ways the dynamic of upholding white comfort and convenience, right? Which is why we have electric bikes, but anyway. The dynamics of upholding white convenience and comfort is moving back into the urban center. We'll see in our public health data that these notions of convenience and corner cutting and just trying to have a quick build solution that benefits the most people as opposed to seeing the needs of people who never get to benefit, right? That is all coming back into reconverging back into the center of our health disparity analysis as well. And so it's like, yeah, we're counting you as POC though, not Black immigrant, not Black formerly incarcerated, not, Black woman who is literally most likely to die just from giving childbirth. We're not counting you in these ways, but we did give you a POC category. That is no different from this conversation that we're having about density. Yeah. Density is not a new concept. We've been in the hood. Y'all put us here. Dense, hella dense, And so I think you're right in that the built environment and public health as a sector are synonymous, or at the very least, the same sector, and inextricable in their relationship to one another. And I think our solutions and practices should mirror that relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think especially to your point too about like data, right? The importance of disaggregating data. I know you're within Portland. Our partners at the City of Portland did a Walking While Black survey and found that Black men stand at the crosswalk 30% more times than their white counterpart. We have data here in Multnomah County that shows us that Black people, right? Black bodies and Black and brown bodies are injured and killed walking and biking. We also receive more citations from police, right? So I'd say it's like looking at all the modes of transportation, there's disparities when we attempt to access it. And I know that's definitely one thing I've always talked about with, managing this REACH grant, where part of it is looking at increasing physical activity in the built environment, right? Where part of our grant is connecting to the Active People Healthy Nation, recognizing that 60% of Americans are not engaging in hour or more physical activity, but knowing with that, that ask, and as we're working and looking at policy systems and environmental changes, we know that Black people, right, walking, biking, or driving to go for a hike, have increased likelihood of encountering some sort of systemic or implicit bias, could lead to injuries and sometimes fatality, right? And I think to me, it will be something to see the urban planning and transportation sector to take on what does safety look like when we center Black men and Black people in our planning and design efforts. We've seen, nationally, right? George Floyd, right on the sidewalk. Eric Gardner, sidewalk. Grice, a young Black boy in the park, right? Trayvon Martin was walking from the store, right? Like, what does that look like? Shift the conversation to acknowledge that Black people mere existence in public spaces oftentimes lead to death.
And then what does it mean to the point at which we acknowledge the problem, and even the point at which we have a solution to the problem, is not the end of that harm or the legacy of it. We are 4 generations in, maybe 5 generations in, to this being our reality. And the same way folks are looking around like, so outside is open, I'm gonna give y'all a month with that before I go outside, Imagine what it could feel like to generations of Black folks who are seeing corporations like the NFL release Black Lives Matter statements. We're a safe space for you,
But when you rejected us though for so long.
Yeah, I'm gonna let y'all test that out for a while, And so this little girl is pretty much telling us, I hear you and thank you, and yeah, I'll take the free hot dog, but I'm about to go back and watch my cartoons. Let me know how this goes. And sure enough, important context is we are 3 years removed from the conversation I had with that little girl, and they are just breaking ground on that street. I have to hold the guilt of making a commitment to this girl and trying to convince her that she can come outside. And the fact that the agency that I represented at the time has in a concerted effort with other agencies, taken 3 years to deliver the intervention that we wrote in our proposal for the funding was specifically for her. How is it that we can do open streets overnight with the help of 1 staffer and no community in the name of a pandemic, and take 3 years for true intervention to even begin? We don't even know if the project will be finished or if there are harm reduction efforts being taken during construction, which is also a huge issue in our field, tearing communities apart for 3-year construction projects. It's
and not acknowledging the health impact, right, and the harm that happens with that.
And then what I've seen is then the gaslighting on the communities that, when I'm in these conversations with planners who are over in Portland, and I'm assuming everywhere, are overwhelmingly white and are solutions oriented, and they're like, oh, okay, well, this is a racism issue, so what are we going to do to solve racism?
Right.
And here are the X, Y, and Z ideas, and so we're just going to solve it by jumping right to action, but
ignore
and do just a little bit of community outreach, and then do a checkbox, and then come back and I'll sit in a meeting and people will be like, well, we've got, it's a perception. We need to change the perception of outside being a scary place. And, talking about people's experiences of the outdoors being racist and being terrifying. And in Portland, like there's also this like another thing of like the emotional trauma of like being displaced.
Yeah.
And then the rebuilding of the inner north and northeast after redlining, and a not acknowledgement of like, that's what kept coming back to me in your thing of like this atonement piece of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like, what is it? Like, we're just high density, big sidewalks, bike lanes. Like, there's no atonement for what we have done.
Yeah. That, and the reason for that is usually, I hear a lot, let me know if y'all hear this in y'all work too. I hear a lot of people saying like, well, we do transportation. Like, that's not a service we provide, right? This racial atonement thing doesn't live in our department. Or we're engineering, this isn't us, you know? Or even we're housing. We don't, you know what I'm saying? Like, we just provide the housing. We don't address the structural racism that creates the need for our agency, right? It's this proverbial kicking of the can down the street for so long. And the idea or the assumption that, well, this is someone's job, it ain't ours though. And when that person steps up and tells us what the solution is and how we can help, we're willing to do it, right? Willingness, pathological altruism, but no accountability, no atonement. And the truth of the matter is that organization, that agency, that person will never come forward because the whole system was built to function as a mechanism of erasure and repression and oppression. There is no, that job has not and will not be assigned within the current structures broadly that we are working in. There isn't an agency whose responsibility this work will be, because this work is the work we collectively create. That's our intention. And so it's a matter of, I think folks are on somewhat of the right track in saying we each need to release an individual statement, right? But what I would really love to see is some reflexive work happening around individual access to power, institutional access to power, and what that power reveals to us about specific and immediate and long-term actions and protections that can be taken to atone. You know, this field, public health, transportation, housing, urban planning sector, we all need to be a part of this conversation around reparations and have our own reparations package to offer to the conversation. Not waiting for the Congress, the congressional committee, or whoever it is to come and tell us with no knowledge or context of how we operate, how to atone. No, we should be coming up with those solutions individually and collectively to offer that to that broader conversation. So this idea of saying, I'm gonna put my Black Lives Matter sign in the window so y'all don't burn my business down, and so y'all know as soon as y'all ready, I got y'all, but without actively working to solve the problem is incredibly harmful and well aligned again with this idea of having convenience in troubleshooting major issues that are killing entire communities, erasing entire communities. No, I'm not hearing any conversation about how there's entire indigenous communities that have been erased as a result of COVID-19. Gone. Gone. No living descendant. You know, we really are in trouble here. And as pressing as climate change is, which I'm also a staunch advocate for, like having some urgency around climate change, as pressing as that is, even climate change has a lot to do with our obsession with white comfort, our overconsumption of convenience. We've got to deal with this. All of it is rooted in anti-Blackness. Slavery is about white comfort and convenience, as much as it's brutal and racist.
You know what? I mean, I think to that point too with around atonement, America has never been about it.
Mm-hmm.
No.
You know, so I'm originally from Liberia, West Africa, and I moved back home a couple of years ago. And one of the things I remember being home and I'm like, I'm so confused why the US government is so invested in funding. I mean, I understand why they were doing it, right? Because Liberia had a civil war that traced back to America, again, obsession with power. But I'm like, here's the United States government funding a Truth and Reconciliation and Healing Commission in Liberia. And did it in South Africa. And then I visited Rwanda, right, where the American government too was invested in that along with other international partners. And then you come back and I'm like, you over here trying to solve this, but you can't even acknowledge your own wrong.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I think especially what has happened to the indigenous people of this nation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, you know what happened with slavery.
Mm-hmm.
I think especially though, I do think atonement and reconciliation and healing should be part of all planning efforts. You know, I know I've been in spaces where, you know, folks would do like the land acknowledgement, they're acknowledging indigenous people of the land.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think I'm like, yes, but there's also more to that, right?
Mm-hmm.
You read the statement and you move on with the agenda that you have planned. What does that look like? Like even before you even start to plan,
Mm-hmm.
you meet with the indigenous people of the land that you want, like you're thanking people, but you haven't really reached them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, performative.
You know, exactly, right? This performative allyship and I'm like, I think especially that piece with atonement and healing, it's definitely happening. Anything, you know, and I think back to just even like my African roots and connection, you know, where you spend a lot of time just thinking and connecting. And I'm like, you know, coming to America where like you're made to feel like farming is a white thing, right? Or being in the environment is a white thing. And then I think back to my childhood, I'm like, literally, I remember growing up where everything you ate literally came from the garden.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, why is that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know, and how like what we were attached to as people, we get stripped of it, and then it's labeled as white. Like I think to my maternal grandmother, who I'm like, she was the mother of sustainability, but she didn't know that big word, right? She repurposed everything under the sun. Nothing got thrown.
Mm-hmm.
You know, then I moved here to the US where it's like, oh, it's white people do that recycling. White people do that. I'm like, actually, I don't think so. You know,
Right.
You know, I think part of it definitely is claiming, like, actually, so I just graduated. One of the things one of my graduation gift is I'm getting a bike, and I'm supposed to be going bike shopping. And people are like, why are you going to get on the bike? And I'm like, why not?
Yeah.
Right. And I think part of it is claiming the space, but I also recognize that in wanting to claim space, right, and trying to read about bikes, like I'm literally reading all these blogs to understand like what kind of bike is good and this and that. I also recognize like what it means to have my Black body on the bike, in the street in the whitest city of its size in the country, right? That's not lost without. I'm like, I've never lost sight of it. You know, I also think about, you know, I've been sharing a lot on social media on how, like, being a mother to a Black son, right, in the midst of the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement. My son, who's now 12, he's grown up, and probably from his age of 5, he's acknowledged Trayvon Martin's death, right? Knows his death. But he loves hopping on a bicycle.
Mm-hmm.
And he knows the fear that I have with it. He literally, before he comes to ask, he's soothing my fear. Like, Mommy, I'm going to be okay to be on the bike. You know? And I'm like, and what does that mean? Like, what does that mean? Right? I don't want my fear to hold him back.
Right.
But know that I need to protect him, right? Because he can be riding in this neighborhood where he was birthed, right? Where have been claimed, what, you know, Black community have lived, but is now gentrified. And I'm like, what if? Because there's so many incidents that you cannot ignore nor dismiss. Like it's happening every day. You know?
Yeah. You know, we don't have to choose between which mentality or understanding to situate ourselves in. You know, we live in a constant state of duality or double consciousness, and you know, it is your son's job to experience joy as a youth and to be uninhibited in that expression. It is your job as a mother to provide strategy and context for that expression of joy that protects his personal safety. It is my job, now that I am outside of a government agency, to offer this position or this analysis up as a way of thinking about how we do work in this sector. And all of our collective work is also coupled with probably the urban planner, maybe even a Black urban planner that is championing bike lanes, that is championing pedestrianism as a primary mode, right? And I think that our experience, our lived experience as Black people, embodies all of those and requires all of those positionalities in order for us to thrive and to survive and be well. You know, like, it is not an either or. Do I get a bike or not? Or do I expose my son to these issues or not? Or do I champion active transportation as a concept or not? I refuse to make that choice. But from my position, from my role, with the education I've been blessed to have, with the lived experiences and traumas that I've been blessed with, it is my role in this space to offer the perspective that I'm offering. No qualms with anyone who is hyper pro bike and feels like it is the most healthy thing to do. There are probably some truths associated with that, and maybe that's what you're called to speak about. I think there's room for all of this here.
So both ends.
Yeah, as we strive toward a reality for young Black boys and grown Black men to move uninhibitedly, right? As that is our desired outcome, we've got to challenge the fact that there are so many people who cannot move through space with anonymity. Trans people are erased. There's versions of Black men who are erased in this, you know? There's versions of Black youth who are erased in this. And so as we think about an ideal world and an ideal streetscape where our able-bodied heterosexual selves can experience joy uninhibited, we also have to make sure we aren't reproducing what has been imposed upon us and erasing other folks from the conversation.
In our community, right?
Yeah.
Because they're a part of us.
Yeah.
Black, trans, even I think especially about the intersection of identities, right? Being Black, trans, and immigrant.
It's a wrap. Yeah. And some people read things like accents and different dialects as disabilities or as lack of education, right? So even the identities that we don't even have a personal affinity to are imposed upon us and assigned to us just because we're in public space. And we have to move through those spaces with awareness, not just of who we are, but how we are perceived and what that means for what we'll experience and how we'll encounter literal death and harm because of it. Like, this is why we can't afford to be looking at this just from our own individual perspective, because how you view yourself in the world has nothing to do with how the world views you and what they're willing to do to and for you because of that.
Absolutely. I mean, to the statement you made about accent, right? So I mentioned being Liberian. So many times my parents, right, they have Liberian accent, right? And I grew up here, so I'm easily able to flip and right to my acculturation and be able to live and claim, my dual identity. But where I would literally, one of my parents would make a phone call somewhere, right? They would literally get quoted at one price. I'll go behind, right, and make that call to the same place, asking questions and being told something totally different. I mean, it happens so much and so often.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like a whole other, I'm like, that's a whole other conversation.
But it's relevant. It's
It
relevant
is.
because if your mother is saying, this is my experience here, and because you don't have a personal experience that mirrors that, despite your proximity to her, we are erasing her in our solution finding.
Yeah.
You know? This happens every day in so many ways. Did we even get to questions? No.
Look. But we hit everything we needed to talk about.
Okay.
Is there anything you really wanted us to hit that you're like, you want us to ask?
No, I feel so good about being able to freely share in a complete context my perspective, or just offer my voice to this broader conversation in a way that's not redacted heavily or edited or on Twitter. And so I'm just incredibly appreciative of that. I have 23 other hours worth of things to say, but I think this conversation, first of all, thank you, Jess, for coming to me and inviting me to this space
Thank
to
you
share.
for saying yes.
Yeah, it's important for us to do this for each other and for us to do this for other folks too. So thank you. I'm really grateful.
Thank you.
No.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, the highlighting the unurban, do you want to tell us a little bit about the Unurbanist Assembly that's coming?
Yeah.
That's happening, then people can kind of tune into that.
Yeah. So the Unurbanist Assembly was conspired. We created it after experiencing a lot of silencing in the broader sense of discourse around urban and transportation planning. And very frequently, my hate messages in my DMs were filled with comments like, "You're a hack, you know nothing about this field, you like not an expert in any way, you're not a true urbanist, how could you be questioning these things?" And that coupled with the really confounding and emotionally and spiritual paralyzing that I experienced. I saw George Floyd's death happen on video on accident. Like, I had been avoiding the video. I remember when CNN was playing Ahmaud Arbery's last moments, I remember making a conscious decision that I wouldn't turn it off, but I'm not going to look at it. Like, I'm going to go to the kitchen, and you can hear people's last breath. It's like loud, even though it's quiet. And I remember feeling like I remember hearing that. I remember hearing that in all of the other videos where someone happened to capture a Black person's last moments. And I remember thinking to myself, I can hear something that to other people is inauditory. You know what I'm saying? Like, not to be too esoteric, but I felt like I was hearing the frequency and the sound of their literal transition out of their bodies. And the irony of that, where I can't even tweet something without people telling me to stop making noise. And feeling like I wanted to resist that, and that I also I'm not one of those people who's blessed with like, I'm not comfortable emoting, like expressing pain openly. Like, literally, I don't have that. Like, I don't get like even when I go to the doctor, like the scale of 1 to 10 doesn't match their version of pain. Like I struggle with emoting pain. And so I know it's not my thoughts and prayers are with you, Tweet. I know that to do something to perform that pain in a way like crying or wailing would be hard for me and time consuming. Like I know I could get there if I was intentional about creating an environment to release, but that itself would be taxing on me emotionally and spiritually. And so I felt like I wanted a way to speak directly to like-minded people actually, but also take up space in a way that would force these people telling me to shut up to know that I'm not shutting up, but that I also wanted to just absolve this, like not absolve, resolve the spiritual turmoil that I feel like I'm struggling to communicate externally. And so that's the idea of being unurbanist. That's where that came about. I don't want to be associated with you. I don't want you to see me as a host to your ideals. I don't want you to see me as a peer. I don't want you to feel like I have my mind wrapped around the history of planning in the way that you have perceived and defined it. I love that you think I'm not an urbanist, you know? And so that's where I began to take on that title. And then the more I thought about it, you know, we're doing 23 hours because Ahmad's run, his last run was 2.3 miles. And so I just knew that my gift, I think, is you know, talking and teaching and holding space with people. And so I just wanted to offer myself up. This is my version of wailing, right? Talking until I no longer have the words, thinking about these things to a point of exhaustion, inquiring and asking and pushing and challenging until someone relents is my version of saying, please stop killing us, you know, or this hurts, because I'm not even talking to the people who are killing us at this point. That's also my revolutionary practice, right? Like understanding who my audience is and who I am here to serve. And I'm convinced that I don't think we have a mechanism for unlearning at the rate that we need it to happen, to be honest. So I'm not having those kind of conversations in service of helping people who hold power to maintain power in a more equitable way. I want to converge and convene with other folks who are unurbanist and anti-racist and Black, and women and artists. I'm an artist. I don't get to be that identity because there's no room for joy in the world and in this work right now. So I want to be around artists, and I want to be around people who have gone at least the first step of imagining a world that isn't this. So the Unurbanist Assembly is the 23 different topics I felt like if I talked about to the point of exhaustion, I would feel like I cried enough. And it's open, for the most part, it's open via live stream. We're still, I think we decided on a platform today, but people can register as live stream participants or as interactive participants. Live stream, will only see the live stream. You can't make comments and ask questions. Interactive participants can ask questions, and if we can get to it, we'll answer them. We also have mostly closed sessions, which are called special assemblies, where I am doing the revolutionary act of holding for space for people who've been made invisible or rendered invisible by the field, and giving those affinity groups complete autonomy in terms of how they want that space to unfold. So it's completely fluid. Everyone has autonomy in the space. Everyone can comment. People can kick people out. People can accept people, present. There's no leadership structure in those spaces. And the participants have the choice of whether or not they want to be subject to white gaze. So we don't know ahead of time which special assembly will be live streamed. but I wanted to create a space where people could bring themselves, regardless of where they are in their learning or thoughts about these various topics, and that my overarching understanding while having these conversations is that, we are actively in the midst of a purple lining, which is a term, a theory that I created or came up with. But it's happening, and it needs to be named, and it needs to be challenged and resisted before those impacts take root. So it's not January, June 18th at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, and it ends the following day of June 19th on Juneteenth at 8 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. RSVP. I believe we are about to run out of space, so thank you to everybody who has reserved a space and donated. Such a blessing. We've got resources. We got a session where anyone who's in the room at the time will get access to free mental health services. So you just kind of have to be there to know. I haven't decided if I'm going to record it either. So you just have to be there to experience it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charlene.
Thank you.
Appreciate you so much.